Hi there, welcome to our video today on Faithful and Fractured by Jason Byassee and Regine proeschold-bell. And actually I got those reversed. It should be proeschold-bell and then Byassee on this book's authors. And this is the Duke Clergy Health Study, a review of the findings from that. So here's the structure of the book. First chapter is creatures doing the Creator's work. Second chapter is when work is holy, the highs and lows. Third chapter is slowed down and overwhelmed. Fourth chapter is some practical guidance on stress. Fifth chapter is pastor's paradox. Sixth chapter is feeling alive. And seventh chapter is clergy flourishing, in their own words. So we'll return to the structure again a couple of times and as we walk through it. So this was the much-awaited clergy stress findings from North Carolina, from the Duke Clergy Health Initiative. And what was amazing about this study, here's the book here. What was amazing about this study is that they got all the Methodist clergy and United Methodist clergy in North Carolina to respond to the survey. So it really is substantive in its findings. And then you could just ask yourself, would it apply in your work situation, or do you see some overlap in your work situation? What are the similarities and differences in what you see? So they suggest that the clergy are crying out for help, and this comes from both the findings and the anecdotal evidence. But the paradox is there's also a lot of benefits and rewards from the calling. And so this book is really an explanation of what they found in this sense. So there's a lack of science behind clergy health. This was a sample size of 1,000 of North Carolina pastors, and 95% responded. And it was a longitudinal study of their self-care. They found that, interestingly, pastors preferred the term spiritual life or spirited life to the term self-care. They had some misgivings about the term self-care itself, which is very interesting if you think about what we know about clergy and reluctance around self-care and the desire to sacrifice. All the significant improvements across this study were in physical outcomes. The study didn't suggest any improvements in mental health. And this approach really focuses on a positive mental health approach. So what are the kinds of things that prevent against stress, that keep people from being stressed out, avoiding mental illness? And this was about a positive approach to those types of things. And positive mental health is a protective factor in the ministry. They suggest that all mainline denominations have similar issues. There was antidepressant medicine was recently recommended to a clergy friend by a psychiatrist who said, most of your colleagues are on antidepressants, right? So just a tremendous kind of invitation and welcoming tone to this book. And I think a lot of the psychological dynamics that you see, they suggest, are because clergy are feeling called to the work, but also there's a demand that they're more likely to have to sacrifice for that work. So distinctive work with its own rewards, but also a sense of having to put in even more than you would in a typical job. Chapter 1, creatures doing the Creator's work. So there's a range of activities that pastors do, and even some of the stress that pastors face comes from switching quickly between those activities. So going between the nursing home and the sermon preparation and administrative duties. And there is a relationship between clergy, long hours for clergy, and mental health difficulties. There's a problem that tends to emerge when pastors feel like they can't take a break or they feel guilty for not doing enough. So 25% of these pastors felt guilty, 9% felt very guilty, and 37% of the... And there was also this issue of expectations. 37% of parishioners wanted more than 40 hours of work from their pastor. So the pastor is a highly visible, often judged figure in the community. And there's also, they mention this dynamic of the person who meets you at the train. So the person who comes to help you unload your bag or meet you at the train often has kind of a hidden agenda for the pastor's work. And so there's a caution there. Those are often the people who are going to become the most critical or have an axe to grind for the pastor. There's a saying, don't let anyone live rent-free in your head. And this seems especially important for pastors. Because when there's chronic critique from people who critique a pastor frequently, that really can get in the pastor's head. So they find themselves kind of thinking about emails first thing in the morning. One of the things that the authors suggest is that the problem that pastors have is that they can't always see how their daily administrative tasks relate to the that calling of ministry that was so orienting and profound early on in their work. And so they define the work of ministry this way: bearing witness, building relationships, and fostering practices of faithful living. That's from page 10. So pastors have one of the most unique skill sets. Almost no other job has this kind of range of skill sets. And so it makes it difficult for pastors to be really good at any one of these things. Their findings from this, the Duke Health Study were that the pastor's own evaluations of what's going on in a situation are incredibly important. So whether they're judging themselves or whether they're thinking they're a failure, those kinds of thoughts that come in when pastors evaluate their work become incredibly important to the pastor's own self-care and mental health. And there's the new world of the internet. I guess it's not new anymore, but parishioners are likely to expect more from their pastors and expect their pastors to be more reachable than they have in the past. And the internet's an anonymous place sometimes where people can say mean things to each other. So that's chapter 1, creatures doing the creator's work. So you could feel the paradox there. The calling is both sacred, but it's also part of what gets people stuck sometimes in patterns that can lead to negative psychological functioning. Chapter 2, where work is holy, highs and lows. Clergy are very satisfied in their work. That's a big finding from the study. They also experience many difficult situations on a routine basis. Clergy experience a lot of positives and a lot of negative emotions. This is really one of the top satisfaction job. The clergy are the top satisfaction job among a range of really highly satisfying jobs. But most people's calls are kind of less dramatic than this. When Matt Bloom in a research study found that he kind of evaluated people's call narratives and found that when all is well with the church, the clergy's call story is more clear and certain. And when things are in conflict, the clergy's call story becomes more conflictual. So a lot of this boils down, they think, to a real kind of sense of sanctification. So when something is sacred to you, it changes the way you act. And because clergy work is sacred by its very nature, clergy need a lot of permission to take a break and take care of themselves again and again. And they also need to kind of clarify the church's priorities. What a lot of this chapter boils down to is, if you're thinking about criticizing your pastor, don't criticize your pastor. Pastors have a more difficult time than people are aware of. And gather around the pastor really crucial people that understand the stressors of the work, a personnel committee that can really help protect them. Otherwise, you might be into a kind of a burnout situation, which burnout includes both emotional exhaustion and then depersonalization, or a lack of personal accomplishment. Some clergy really struggled with a lack of personal accomplishment. It's one of those hard jobs, really difficult to know when you're being successful sometimes, because what you're measuring is not really numbers, but it's something more intangible, spiritual growth or the kingdom or something like that. Okay, chapter 3, slowed down and overwhelmed. This chapter talked about the psychological dimensions of depression for clergy, which can include sleeping a lot, low energy, low appetite. It can also include its reverse, eating a lot. The psychological factors of depression are feeling guilty or worthless and having trouble concentrating. Incidentally, clergy have a similar burnout rate to social workers and have a worse burnout rate than mental health counselors. Also, clergy may have depressive symptoms but not be depressed. So they might fall into a category that doesn't quite reach into the major depression. Something like what the mental health field calls dysthymia, maybe. So 11% of the clergy reported depression, which would have been normal over the course of a year. Here's a really important finding, though. Male clergy have a depression rate at 2 times the rates of depression among males in general. And so this led the researchers to ask, are men seeking kind of comfort in the church through working in the church with depression? We don't know exactly. Ministry work is not necessarily the cause. Maybe ministry work might even be a protective factor against depression. 56% of female pastors and 39% of male pastors had seen a therapist in the past year, which they found to be, depending on how you sliced it, kind of a helpful and good statistic. They talk about rating what is appearing as meaningful in your life. Clergy who tend to become depressed are the ones who have the higher demands and lower rewards. They also have critical people who place a lot of demands on them in their congregations. And those folks are more likely to be depressed. These might be the type of congregants who tend to forget that their pastor is a person as well. Pastors also tend to pastors everywhere tend to compare themselves to pastors in the largest churches. So there's kind of that dynamic as well. So they talk about kind of setting guidelines for yourself. What are you meant to do, including sleep, exercise, and nutrition? How 40% of people in the U.S. don't drink alcohol at all, alcohol is a contributing factor to depression as well. Okay, so that was the chapter on depression, slowed down and overwhelmed. Chapter 4, practical guideline on stress. So stress symptoms is what they're talking about here. When you feel out of control, when you feel out of sync with your values, you're at risk of stress. So more stressors don't necessarily equal more stress. It also has to do with how you evaluate them. People's stress doesn't just add up in kind of just a way, if you have this or that thing, it means more stress. But it also has to do with the meaning that you're giving to the stress. They talk about packing your personnel team with your A team. I think I mentioned that before. And they talk about trying to assess whether a certain event will cause you stress. Associative processing, here's a new term for me, is what happens when you're spinning out of control and your thinking is kind of going into a downward spiral. It's going faster than your reasoning. Associative processing happens when you hit a stress and then you kind of crumble and you think it's the end of the world, or it's like catastrophizing or something like that. And they make a difference between hindrance demands and challenge demands. So things that you feel like you can keep up with, and then things that are a hindrance. Among some of the most important approaches to stress are keeping up with friendships, divert people away from criticisms, and then they noticed that pastors tended to turn inward to deal with their problems. So 70% of the clergy say that they could get the support that they need. They discuss this issue of parishioner friendships, which seems like a kind of almost inevitable factor, but they also discuss how it can create odd boundaries, and how more men are married, and so they relied upon spouses for their support, but women didn't always have that kind of support in ministry. Most clergy tended to have good relationships with fellow pastors, and most tend to have good relationships with family members. They talk about kind of ritualizing letting go of stressors. So it's really important when you have a stressful experience to kind of have a cup of tea and release it, and really kind of celebrate that letting go. Learn to let go in an active way. Okay, that was the chapter on stress. The Pastor's Paradox, chapter 5. Obesity rates are they're more than 10 times higher than the average among everyday people in North Carolina. So in fact, the clergy in the 55 to 64 age bracket are particularly unhealthy. Jason Byassee talks in here about eating a whole box of cookies, and there's just some really nice descriptions of kind of these experiences. And they talk about kind of why isn't that attending churches actually make us healthier, but it tends not to. They do talk about the factors that actually people who have a lot of church attendance tend to have better health. And they talk about how church provides some protective factors around people's behavior, and also social support. Most clergy do not think that their ill health gets in the way of their work, which was interesting. But a kind of fundamental takeaway from this chapter was that every pastor needs to know that they're at risk for weight gain in regards to their work. Okay, chapter 6, Feeling Alive, Positive Emotions. I would say I took the longest notes on this chapter. It's probably the most important chapter in the book. So clergy well-being is more than avoiding mental illness. It's actually fostering positive emotions. And so what are the kind of evolutionary impacts of positive emotions? They talk about research on positive emotions that say if you've watched a scary movie, just experiencing some positive emotions can help you recover more quickly. Positive emotions, if you can establish things like joy and humor in your life, will make it easier for you then to deal with the difficult emotions and build positivity. And sometimes that means kind of accepting the positive things that are going around us and allowing them to be blessings to us. Do we hear something encouraging and then accept that positive compliment? And so allowing those things to kind of lead to positive emotions. They talk about how clergy have very low and very high emotions in a given week, more so than other professionals. And they address this question of why did clergy used to live longer than the average population, but that's no longer the case. Clergy actually live shorter than the average population now. They say that what we really need to do is watch videos of internet puppies. So watch things that are really going to make you happy, or sometimes I show my students videos of the Grand Canyon before we talk about a difficult topic. So kind of creating awe, creating joy and wonder does several things for your social functioning. It creates integration. It creates kind of feelings of acceptance, and it creates a kind of sense of coherence. So the good news is that clergy are languishing less than others in society. And the good news is also that high positive mental health can prevent future mental illness and health problems. And here, physical health and mental health are closely related too. So stress for these authors is not a state, but a series of thoughts, a series of appraisals that happen. Mental health and mental illness are actually on two separate continua. And so here we're getting into chapter 7. clergy flourishing in their own words. So, chapter 7, clergy flourishing in their own words. So mental health and mental illness are on two separate continua. In other words, you can foster mental well-being, and that actually provides a separate source of meaning apart from a pathological framework or a framework of diagnoses or illness. These authors found that for clergy flourishing, maintaining strong social health and social relationships was especially important when experiencing difficulties. They talk about kind of common experiences of associate pastors, women especially, experiencing inappropriate comments from other pastors or people in congregations, and how to deal with those dynamics of uncomfortable behavior. And they talk about kind of expectations related to clergy partners, spouse, and family members. A major takeaway from the clergy flourishing part of this was that aging well requires friendships. Flourishing pastors saw themselves as participants in God's work rather than the ones who did it all themselves. And in fact, that centrality of a relationship with God took them away from the success paradigm or success orientation. So it wasn't so much about whether they did well as being oriented to God's work. And this really helped with self-care too. Here was an important quote from one pastor on page 134. "We don't just have to destroy ourselves in order to save our church." End quote. So pastors with low mental health complained about working a lot and taking work home, often caring for sick loved ones as well. So for the pastors who were struggling the most in the study, they also might have had bivocational work, or they might have been caring for a loved one as well. So they could have or it be in the sandwich generation. So they might have had multiple stressors. So they talk about lifestyle changes in this pastoral paradox, working as though the result depends upon us, and at the same time as if none of it depends upon us. So I'll say that again, working as though the result depends upon us, and then also working as though none of it depends upon us. So you try to get out of the way of criticism or praise as much as you can, because you know if you're praised a lot in this area, you're likely to face criticism down the line. So watching for the praise that can become a trap as well. They talk a lot about setting boundaries without being harsh about it. So there's some nice, helpful tips and tricks here about negotiating time off early on and setting boundaries, and then seeing how that's gone. They also talk about how to encourage direct communication. So when there's people in conflict, encouraging them to talk to one another rather than bringing all of that to you. They talk about how female pastors tend to be lower paid and are more likely to be associates than their male colleagues. And they often faced strange pressures like not letting your slip show. So kind of that management of female sexuality in the workplace as well. And they talk about an additional pressure of thinking you have to work 4 times harder because of being a female in a traditionally male space. Some women even said through the clergy assignment system that they wish they were a man. The women clergy tended to lack intimate, trusting friendships, and also engaged in substantial caregiving outside of their work. So there were multiple pressures of caregiving, both inside ministry and outside. They found especially short tenure pastors with mental health problems had no one to talk to. And young female pastors also typically had no one to turn to as well. African American pastors, there was just some discussion of race as a factor here, but not a lot. They said they needed a place to let their hair down and accept themselves. Things related to both positive and negative mental health and social support. they found that social support, isolation, financial distress, and congregational demands came together to be a really important factor in the clergy climate. So the clergy, how the clergy felt, had a lot to do with how they set the tone of their church and what that tone was like. Some pastors talked about being a Christian before you're a pastor. So finding ways to continue to cultivate your spiritual life. A couple of key takeaways from this book were that clergy tend overall to be more satisfied with their work than people in other professions. And that's partly because it's such sacred work. And then clergy also tend to have a lot of highs and lows in their work. So great fluctuations between positive feelings and negative feelings, even within the same week. And there were some signs that clergy were more likely to suffer from depression in ministry and also more likely to be obese than their colleagues. But what I came away from reading the book was a real sense that we could strengthen positive mental health for pastors and for ourselves by focusing on these positive emotions that they talk about that can be broadened and built through practice. These positive emotions like joy, awe, wonder, these positive emotions ground us, and they make it more likely that we're going to be able to be creative and think flexibly and recover when something difficult comes down the line. So you might just think about kind of a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio of positivity versus negativity in your work. And what are some ways that you could allow those moments of blessing, allow those moments of grace to kind of sink in rather than rushing to the next criticism or the next problem. And so the book, Faithful and Fractured, was a really helpful look at what people take on in ministry and what the hidden aspects of the job description are, as well as some of the challenges that people face in their ministry. And the challenges are different based on what your race, gender, social location might be. But there's also shared elements to the challenges of ministry that I think if I had one takeaway from this book, it was you can't emphasize self-care for pastors enough. Some ministry environments can be toxic, and we need to address those directly and challenge people to be kinder than they might have ever imagined needing to be with pastors, simply because of the nature and the emotional challenges of this job. So I highly recommend Faithful and Fractured to you. This book alternates between the psychological data and the practical theological reflections, the ministerial language. It's very accessible. And even if you're from a different ministerial context, I think there's aspects of this that you're going to probably relate to, and that you're probably going to come away from this book with more resources for self-care and more ideas about the importance of self-care than you would have thought before. So this book is highly recommended to Methodists and non-Methodists alike working in different contexts. Thank you so much.